Alrighty, now we can officially start then. Hi everyone, I'm Julie Takakshin. I am a policy advisor in the newly formed Resiliency and Sustainability Division at the Office of General Services, which, as Kevin mentioned, we're both a part of the Green New York Council, and I'll let the rest of my team members introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. Bill Calabrese, Senior Policy Advisor for Resiliency and Sustainability here at OGS.
Marianne, I don't think we can hear you.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good afternoon. I'm Marianne Jang. I'm also Senior Policy Advisor in the Resiliency and Sustainability team at OGS.
Awesome. All right, so I just want to give a little context for the title of this presentation, EO22 and You. The you in this presentation that we're talking to is the affected entities of EO22, which are mainly just the state agencies and SUNYs. Municipalities and such are not subject to this EO. We're going to go over a lot because the EO covers quite a bit. So we'll be going a little bit quickly, but feel free to drop questions in the chat. And we'll cover expectations of the EO, how to comply, and some guidance. So let's jump on in. So why a new EO and who exactly does it cover? The new EO supersedes previous EOs on climate and sustainability initiatives and really just consolidates it into one clean executive order. And it creates some new goals and targets for sustainable operations for state government. It also established formally the Green New York Council as the primary body that is responsible for implementing the EO and giving agencies and affected entities guidance. So this slide covers a little bit about the reporting and planning requirements from the EO. So the Green New York report, which I'm sure a lot of you have submitted data for in the past, usually comes out in the spring to align with Earth Day, but is going to now come out in the future in September to align with Climate Week in New York. And the data that you all are providing to the Green New York Council really helps us to aggregate up and improve our state agencies across the board. It helps us to keep track of things like GHG emissions and set baselines and make progress on things like energy efficiency, waste diversion, procurement, and a lot more, as you'll see. And the Green New York Council, as I stated, is going to help affected entities plan to meet your goals. So jumping into a bit of the content, excuse me, of the EO, the first topic we'll cover is electricity. So this might look like a familiar goal to you all. The goal is to have 100% renewable electricity power agency operations by 2030. And this goal is reiterated in the EO from the CLCPA, or the Climate Act, that was passed a couple of years ago. And the EO outlines a bit about how to achieve these goals. So how to comply, we've got a three-step process. The first step is to obviously take account for your affected entity's electricity consumption. And then next, to use on-site or off-site eligible systems under CES to help maximize your use of renewable electricity. And then where there might still be some remaining gaps in your electricity usage, NYSERDA and DPS will work with your affected entity to help procure some qualifying renewable energy credits. And just a little bit more to close out the electricity section. NYSERDA and DPS are going to release some more guidelines on this moving forward. And then the Green New York Council is going to work to monitor the progress on this and then make corresponding updates and changes to help us reach this goal. All right, so energy efficiency, the next part of the executive order. If you all have heard of Build Smart 2025, this is just being reiterated in the new executive order. The main goal for affected entities in Build Smart is to reduce energy consumption by 11 trillion BTUs by 2025. And for those of you who are responsible for inputting information into NIAM, I'm sure that the New York Energy Manager, I'm sure that this might be a little bit repetitive for you, but just some information in case anyone is curious. There are some ongoing inputs and some one-time inputs that need to go into NIAM. And the next slide is going to show sort of a timeline and overall list of those inputs. But the one-time inputs are mainly just some plans and audits. And then the ongoing inputs into NIAM help to catalog your affected entity's contribution to this overall goal of 11 trillion BTUs being diminished. And by the two main things that you're doing or inputting into NIAM to catalog your contributions to this goal are energy consumption data to help with benchmarking, and then energy saving project data. So things for your project pipeline. And again, this is just a timeline and FYI for the Build Smart deliverables into NIAM. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Bill Calabrese to talk about fleet electrification now.
Thanks, Julie. So for fleet, we have a goal to have 100% of our light-duty non-emergency vehicles to be zero-emission vehicles by 2035, and 100% of medium heavy-duty vehicles by 2040. Important to note for here, like definition purposes, a zero-emission vehicle is one that is plug-in, so not a ICE or internal combustion engine hybrid that has kind of like the regenerative braking, thinking of like the old kind of like Honda Civics. Basically what we're looking for are plugs. Priority certainly for the plug-in battery electric vehicles, but plug-in hybrids will certainly work primarily, certainly in like also in the near term where they may be more available than full-on battery electrics, and to the degree that they do become available in the future, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles would also be appropriate under this as well. Similar to some of the other goals within this executive order, a lot of what we're trying to understand is get better kind of like reporting and projecting of how we're going to meet these goals. So agencies will be required to file plans for how they'll be converting their light duty fleet within a year, and then a little bit longer on medium heavy duty within 3 years. Following the initial submission of the plan, you would then be required to update that every 3 years within each category. For emergency vehicles, that is something that you will also need to assess and report out, but kind of, knowing that these may require special build outs or may not have the same kind of availability as a light duty vehicle, the requirement here is that you must evaluate and test the technologies to make sure that they to see if they could meet your needs. And then we can begin to adopt those on kind of like a case-by-case basis. But again, just trying to get a better awareness into understanding your own kind of emergency vehicle fleet, and to the degree in which that existing ZEVs can meet those needs is something that we're sort of interested in and trying to help you meet those goals as well, but trying to disaggregate emergency and non-emergency. Next slide, please. So our team at OGS Resiliency and Sustainability has been launching a few initiatives related to this effort. For one, we've been working with NYSERDA to launch a broader clean fleet plan. This is going to take a look at the whole statewide fleet as a whole, begin to look at kind of like the categories of use and vehicles that we see existing within the fleet. For example, maybe there's like a small kind of like sedan that is very, like there's a lot of readily available EV analogs out there. It's a vehicle that's parked in a garage, so could have easier access to a charger, versus there might be as I mentioned before, cars that require kind of like special build outs and have like less kind of existing availability in the market, and or might have uses that are going to more remote areas or are even brought home by employees on a nightly basis. These are going to have different kinds of timelines for how you're going to convert those types of vehicles. And we're hoping to identify those categories in this Clean Fleet Plan, which we will be launching in January. And so while this will be happening concurrently to the agency plans, the goal is to use a lot of our efforts through Green New York to begin sharing a lot of those findings that you can begin leveraging that work as you're undertaking the agency conversion plans. And we will be developing with the Green New York Leadership Group and Council a template and further guidance to demonstrate what agencies will actually be needed to do to submit that work. We've started to look at some other states and examples for what that could look like. And we are convening on a monthly basis a ZEV interagency working group specific to fleet. And we'll be using that group to try to begin socializing a lot of those findings. It's also a place where we're going to be sharing other kinds of resources where we can kind of use that to develop kind of like standardized specifications, understanding what matters in contracting for EV chargers. And so if this is something that you're interested in being plugged into, you can email sustainability@ogs.ny.gov, and we're happy to loop you in there. If there is places that you know that you want to have chargers installed as well, this is something we're interested in and trying to get organized around. You can fill out a tenant alteration request. We're beginning to discuss that internally with our own Division of Real Estate and Facilities Management teams, and as well as with NYPA as we begin to think about the broader strategy for how we are rolling out charging infrastructure across the state. It's very much something that is, going to enable larger scaling up of EV conversion. And so we want to make sure that is certainly in place. And we're going to be sort of learning by doing as we expand this throughout our state facilities. Next slide, please. So on embodied carbon in building construction, the requirement here was that starting for January 24, all new construction submitted for permitting will avoid infrastructure, building systems, or equipment used for the combustion of fossil fuels. The exclusion that was outlined includes backup generators, which, to date, we don't have maybe like a readily deployable electric option yet. So, we don't want to disrupt these capital projects and their schedules, but to the degree it's feasible that we can begin integrating this into these projects. So again, like there was some conditional language to make sure that this happens as practicable, but we want to work with you to identify those opportunities so that we can begin moving away from fossil fuels in all of our operations and construction projects. Next slide. We are working to issue operational directives and guidance around this. We have a work group that is going to be launching as well in the new year around lower carbon concrete and materials, and the embodied carbon requirement, which is slated in the EO as starting for 2023, acknowledging that's, mere days away. So this is something that we're going to be coming to you all more in the near term, but it's something we're also working with our own design and construction team to make sure this is implemented in a way that can be integrated into your workflows and has sort of a very kind of like clear kind of calculation and method that allows us to get a better handle on what the existing embodied carbon is for a particular project and identify different kinds of materials or solutions that could lower that embodied carbon. on this will be required for new construction or the significant adaptive reuse or renovations that cost greater than 50% of the cost of new construction. Next slide.
All right. Thanks, Bill. I'm going to take
Yeah.
back over. All right, so the next part of the EO touches on waste reduction. And there's one really big goal here, which is to see a 10% decrease in waste disposal every 5 years from a fiscal year 18-19 baseline until eventually reaching a goal of 75% waste reduction. So the way that this is going to work is that DEC is going to look back at the old Green New York reports data from fiscal year 18-19 and be providing each agency with their baseline. And then below on the slide, you can see the 4 different waste categories that are defined. So much like other things in this EO, waste reduction also requires that affected entities submit a plan for how they're going to realize this goal. So the Green New York Council is going to be working on creating a waste diversion plan template, and a year from the date that template is released is when it will be due back to the council. And our goal is really to make this a very straightforward template, so you're not spending too much time and effort digging up, sort of abstract data for waste reduction, and you can just plug and play and then submit it back to the Green New York Council. The next part of the executive order discusses reducing toxic chemical use. So the goal here is for affected entities to evaluate and incorporate toxic use reduction strategies so that they can help prevent pollution. And one of the easier ways to comply with this portion of the executive order is to actually just look at existing specifications, because these mostly account for this part of the executive order. So as long as you're following those, you should be in pretty safe territory. And then moving forward, the Green New York Council will also be giving some more just information on what reducing toxic chemical use would look like in your buildings and offices. So low impact development, there are 2 main components to this in the executive order. The first component is green infrastructure. And this looks like reducing stormwater runoff and improving water quality in affected entities' construction projects. The second component of low impact development is climate risk, which we're asking that affected entities account for in their new construction or infrastructure and building projects, because it's really quite important to preserving open spaces and to mitigating climate change. And again, like many other things in the EO, the Green New York Council is going to be providing further guidance on both the green infrastructure and climate risk components of low impact development. So closely tied to low impact development, but also distinct from in the executive order, is promoting biodiversity and habitat protection. So you can see here, there are 3 main goals listed in the EO. The first is to support native biodiversity and the New York State Pollinator Protection Plan. The next is to protect threatened and endangered species. And last is to increase climate resilience and natural carbon storage. So the Green New York Council is also going to provide a template for this to help implement early detection and rapid response protocol for invasive species. And also related to invasive species, the EO asks that affected entities prioritize the use of integrated pest management techniques, because it just tends to be a little bit better for everyone involved. All right, and then seeing how the EO and its goals impact the community is a really big part of this executive order too. So I'm sure many of you have heard of disadvantaged communities. It is a definition that the state is still working on the criteria for. But on this slide, you can see the language in the EO that references disadvantaged communities. I might call them DACs from now on, if you don't mind, because it's a mouthful. The EO really calls on affected entities to do two things with regard to DACs. The first is to look to minimize negative environmental impacts when submitting your plans and building out your plans and carrying them out, and also to prioritize environmental upgrades in these communities. So just something to keep in mind when you're executing the goals in this EO and planning for them. This slide shows more detail about the definition of disadvantaged communities. Right now, there are 45 different indicators and criteria for disadvantaged communities, and they can generally be sorted into two different categories. The first is environmental burdens and climate risk, and then the next is population characteristics and health vulnerabilities. And this is a tool that's online right now. If you're curious to check it out, it's at climate.ny.gov, and it uses census data and a map of New York to map out where disadvantaged communities are. And it will also show different population characteristics and the environmental burdens and climate risk faced by these communities. So just some closing remarks and thoughts. The first is to, hopefully you already have, if you haven't, convene or develop your sustainability team. If you're looking to get involved with your agency or campuses or otherwise affected entities' sustainability initiatives, get in contact with your sustainability coordinator. Every affected entity is required to have one, so you definitely have one. And we would like to encourage that a well-rounded sustainability team have input from many different parts of your affected entities. So from executive to fleet to finance, a well-rounded team is a better team. The next point here is to get access to the Green New York SharePoint. This is where we're posting some important news and resources for you all. Going back to the Build Smart 2025 goal that NYPA has, make sure that the relevant people at your affected entities have access to NIAM and are updating your project pipeline so that you're getting credit toward that 11 trillion BTU reduction goal. And then finally, just stay tuned for more resources, keep coming to events like these, and look out for updates from working groups and from the Green New York Council. Thank you so much, and we're happy to take questions now.
And actually saw, oh, sorry, I was just going to respond to, I saw a question from DOT on electric vehicle goals. So I just kind of wanted to respond to that. I was typing on answer, but easier just to talk it out. There, just like want to acknowledge, certainly there is like some, market challenges, and like the timeline for getting an electric vehicle today that you put an order in is not, going to be delivered in a month or even 6 months. So like we're trying to be very realistic about what it takes to get an electric vehicle, and trying to build that into our timelines. I think what we're trying to really do through this agency planning effort is to gut check what this looks like for each particular agency, and how we need to like redirect resources and find the more challenging cases that might require more assistance. There are some agencies that have small fleets, many of which could be converted more in the near term. And yes, this may not happen like next year, but hopefully within like 3 years, you could move, let's say, some portion of your fleet to electric. And so trying to be able to do that where feasible, and then understanding the barriers, to better understanding the barriers where it's not feasible, is going to give us better information to help you make that conversion. And then on charging infrastructure, that's really kind of like our first priority right now. And OGS is working to build out a number of pathways and with related kind of on-call contracts, both through our design and construction team, as well as with NYPA, to identify the places where that charging infrastructure is most vital, and then to begin just getting in the ground as soon as possible. Again, this is something I think we're going to learn by doing, and as we get better data and information, that'll help us to roll that out more effectively, and is something else that is going to happen not just like through New York State facilities, but as part of like a broader statewide as well as federal initiative to have public charging available really across the country. So there's going to be a variety of options that should help you find those ports, and we are going to be focused on state facilities, but trying to make sure we know the places where it's most cost effective and useful for our agencies to have that.
Bill, just to add something quick for folks who have kind of like the state level questions, the final Climate Action Council scoping plan is set to be released next week, and the transportation and electricity chapters will, I think, explain more of the broader goals of that, and it does include what we're doing at Green New York and some of those strategies. And then I also just want to acknowledge that Cordell had a hand up. I think you're unmuted now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, a lot of stuff got covered really fast. How do I get involved again? Like, how do I find out my coordinator for my agency?
You guys aren't sorry. There I am. Thank you. I believe that information is on the Green New York SharePoint.
All right, and how do I get to be on the SharePoint?
Do you give access to that?
You can email myself, Kevin Briard. I just put the email in, and Brendan, who I'm appearing as Brendan, but Brendan and I manage the SharePoint, so between the two of us, we'll get you access.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
So just looking at the list of questions, there was also one about when there'll be better opportunities for recycling and composting in state buildings like Corning Tower. If anyone wants to hazard an answer to that. I mean, I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, as of now, I just know that the state is looking into the state is looking into doing that for its own operations, and I know there'll be a chapter, again, pointing to what Kevin was saying earlier, in the draft scoping plan for the Climate Action Council's draft scoping plan that will be coming out later this month. There'll be a section on waste and the waste management operations in state buildings. I think that's the extent of what I'm aware of right now.
I would also just add, this is something that through the waste planning efforts are sort of directed at the agencies to identify how they will meet those waste reduction goals. So certainly for a case like Corning Tower, we'll be on OGS through our waste planning efforts to show how increased recycling and composting can help meet that. But this is something that's also probably not going to be uniform across the state and going to be reliant on what kind of carting options you might have in a particular area. But yes, also as the resiliency and sustainability team at OGS, we're very excited to find these kinds of opportunities and where we can begin implementing them.
There was another question here around fleet electrification. The question was, is infrastructure going to be in place for all state agencies by 2039?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yeah, it was the question
yes.
was, is fleet infrastructure so regarding fleet electrification, is charging infrastructure going to be in place for all state agencies by 2039?
Yeah, again, this is like something that we are trying to get that plan put together as quickly as possible. Like we have the need is there, and so we're not trying to wait while we plan. And so we'll be, again, trying to roll out and starting the scaling up of our infrastructure starting next year. But as we're undertaking that planning, should have a better sense of, like, for example, what is that like ratio for vehicles to chargers? And again, like looking at those specific use cases and how those vehicles are used, where they're parked and stored. What is the best kind of like operational considerations for how they leave a garage with a full charge, where that happens, and where that can be supplemented through on-the-go charging as appropriate. So it's going to be a variety of ways that we're going to be meeting the needs of these vehicles, and something that, again, is happening like throughout the state and beyond kind of like our own operations. The existing kind of like mandate reinforced by the governor, like, will make it so you can't even really buy a new non-electric vehicle after 2035. So this is a major effort happening that all kind of like state governments are tackling. And so it's going to be supplemented through a variety of means.
Right. There was another question here about the construction goals. So would you revisit the new construction goals for January 2024? Question was, avoid fossil fuel for combustion equipment. Does that mean equipment used on the job site for construction, building heating systems that use renewable energy? I guess the question here is, yeah, what is this? What do we mean exactly by avoid fossil fuel for combustion equipment?
Yeah, and this is one where, like, again, there should be a lot more better information, like through that guidance, that we are trying to work with our design and construction and facilities teams to identify what that looks like. But for example, like, this could be part of like the construction process itself, but it also could be part of like the what you're building. And if you're able to use, for example, like heat pumps instead of boilers, or other kinds of solutions that are electrifying the actual operations. This is like an essential component of our overall kind of climate goals. And so we're just trying to get that socialized into our operations as feasible and doable. But yes, this is going to take some work to identify how we find what is more doable in the near term. Again, things like generators won't, there may not be those kinds of answers readily available today. And so understanding that that's not going to be part of the toolkit immediately, but something that we're going to work with you to identify how to do it on an ongoing basis, and see those, like the embodied carbon calculation, as like a good means to demonstrate where you can have like the best kind of like bang for buck in reducing carbon emissions.
And then just following that, I guess the question was, will we be preparing guidelines for embodied carbon, sort of, how to use low embodied carbon materials?
Yeah, so there's like a variety of, we've been largely talking with some of our partners in NYSERDA, who have been giving this a lot of thought. We've been meeting, or are going to meet with our city or city, the same kind of thought leaders in the city who have also issued guidance on this front. There are some existing kind of out of the box solutions that can help you to come up with a embodied carbon calculation. There are some less intensive means to give you kind of like an order of magnitude sense of what a particular project is contributing to carbon emissions. So more to come there. I think like we're trying to evaluate what those range of options look like, what those trade-offs are, and if there are any other kind of like implications for a particular project that we want to be aware of, to make sure, again, that we're not disrupting the development of capital projects and setting them back while we're trying to meet our sustainability goals. So yes, backup generators. I've seen a lot of notes about backup generators and resiliencies. Like that's something that we realized those are not out there yet. As the technology improves and becomes available. Actually, Marianne, can you mute?
Still, yeah, I was going to say.
We're in the same room, so it's getting some echo. As those things are available, like that is something that we would want to bring into the mix, but that is explicitly called out as an exemption to the existing kind of order. So there are places where this order just like outright says, like, you know we're not yet there yet, and there's kind of like a standing exemption. And then there's places where we're just trying to get better documentation and understanding where those exemptions are being met. So for example, in some of the leasing requirements around Build Smart 2025. And so the idea is that we would be able to work with you to integrate these solutions as they become available. But just like knowing where that is not yet the case is going to give us better information than what we really have today as like as a whole.
Are there any other questions?
I'm going to say it generated a lot of interesting chat in the side that it was hard to keep up with everything. But definitely a lot of interesting questions around the fleet electrification and the embodied carbon guidance seems to have resonated the most, and interest in just being involved as a with the sustainability work. That's great. I don't know if there is any more.
That's all. I think, Kevin, we're all good.
I just got one more note on a question. Cordell, I can unmute you again.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay.
I had a question as to are municipalities eventually going to be included in the future, and how far out, because that would definitely have an impact as well on a lot of these items that you covered.
Right now, that's not within our scope, but definitely a good point.
All right. Yeah, thank you again, Julie, Marianne, and Bill for joining our Lunch and Learn today. I know folks have my email and Brendan's for the SharePoint access, but if you have questions for the panelists and you don't have their email handy, you can also, as a backup, direct them through us. Sorry, I'm just making sure nothing came in last second. All right. Yeah. Thanks again, everyone, and get a little bit of your lunchtime back.
Yeah. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.